We're live, live.
Live from the Plutopia News Network. This is the Plutopia Happy Hour, and we're pleased to welcome our guest this time around, Brian Alexander, and missing in action, Kevin Welch, who is supposed to be here. He's being stylishly late, I'm sure. And the not ready for cable news players are here. Maggie Duvall, our foreign correspondent in house. Scoop Sweeney, that's me over here in the funny-looking studio. And our podmaster from South Austin, John Lebkowski.
I'm not sure I want to be associated with pods.
Depends on what's in the pod.
Yeah, what does a podmaster do?
That's what we're going to ask you.
Or is it the podmaster of ceremonies?
Pod wrangler.
Yes, now that I've lowered the intellectual level.
So I guess we should mention that Brian, who is joining us tonight, is an award-winning, internationally known futurist, researcher, writer, speaker, consultant, and teacher, and also a fan of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which is what brings us here tonight.
Indeed.
And we hope that Kevin will join us. We're not certain where he is. He could be lost in the ozone. He could have been replaced by a seed pod.
I think his pod was ripe by now, so you never know.
So there are 4 versions of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Actually, there's 2 that are called Invasion of the Body Snatchers films. There's one that's called Body Snatchers, and then there's one that's called Invasion. And those last 2, Body Snatchers and Invasion, are not as faithful to the original book by Jack Finney. And I think that in our discussion tonight, we're going to pretend that those 2 don't exist and focus on the 56th version, which was directed by Don Siegel, and the 78 version, which was directed by Philip Kaufman. Which is your favorite, Brian?
Well, I'll just quickly put in a vote for the 93 one, which I think is underrated. It's got some great stuff going on in it, some killer scenes. But for me, the original, the 1950s one, it has the rawness, the simplicity, the direction. It feels like a single dream or a unified Twilight Zone episode. Plus, there's the legend or the story about the ending. You know, the original ending was deemed too terrifying for audiences. I like the 1970s one a lot. It's more leisurely. It kind of expands into it, and it has a lot of pointed satire at the 1970s. But I really do prefer the original.
I kind of like that dog in the 78 version. You recall the a sort of failed transition where the dog and his owner were mixed. That dog just shows up for a minute, though.
I'm not sure what my favorite part of that would be. If it's Leonard Nimoy cracking wise and being a kind of badass, or it's the famous ending. I'm not going to imitate the scream, but that horrible look and the finger pointing,
which is closer to the intended ending of the original, which was, Miles Bennell in traffic screaming we saw that in the original, but they tacked on a kind of frame that ended the film with, I don't know, the authorities calling the FBI and sending them over to Santa Mira to deal with things, which was, certainly a softening of the original intention.
Got to imagine J. Edgar Hoover getting wind of this, and like one part of him thinking, it's clearly a communist conspiracy involving Black people, but then the other part of him saying, but I admire their technique.
I wonder if I can make a deal with these plant people.
Yeah, I definitely have to vote for the original, and I watched it again today for the first time in a long, long time. And watching it, I remembered why I hadn't been watching, because 1956 ish, when I saw it, I was a young kid out in West Texas, living in a very white bread environment where things like that really weren't exposed to young minds. And it scared the shit out of me. I mean, literally, I didn't sleep for a couple of nights. And I was an avid sci-fi reader, but none of the sci-fi that I'd been exposed to had that kind of effect on me, because it was like this struck my childish mind as being possible. And when that happens, then you get terrified. And watching it this afternoon, I suddenly had that same discomfort. I remembered being that kid, and it was hard to continue watching it, but I did, and I love that movie.
It's really frightening to see a bunch of people gradually being turned into Republicans like that.
But yeah, it was definitely, you could see the ghost of McCarthy and, the John Birch Society hovering in the background, saying, "Oh, very good."
Yeah, some people thought it was a commentary on the McCarthy era, and some thought it was really about communism. But the guys who actually made the movie said that they didn't have any of that in mind, that it was just kind of a thriller. Maybe, I mean, to some extent, I think Don Siegel said that he was concerned about people kind of losing their individuality, and that it was a commentary on that. But I don't think it was specifically intended to be as political as some people think that it was.
Well, the McCarthyites really saw communists hiding, under every bed and in every closet, especially in Hollywood.
I had a communist in my closet.
Which one?
I did have my Lenin action figure, but it was the other Lenin.
My mother was a pretty hardcore Stalinist, in all seriousness. I mean,
Really?
So I saw that. But in the 50s, it's a great period of monster movies. So coming up with new monsters is something that gets iterated again and again. But at the same time, one of the great powers of monsters is that they fit uneasily into the world by their very nature. So you can see it as a fear of McCarthy and the John Birch movement. And you can also play it as a fear of communism and uniformity. Or you could turn around and see it as the man, the gray flannel suit, the fear of corporate culture being uniform. You can imagine the Levittows as a architectural expression of the pod principle, if you like. Monsters are mobile, which is why there are 3 remakes.
Well, maybe one of the things that made this particularly scary is that these monsters were fitting too easily into the world. They were completely like the humans that they replicated, except they lacked emotion.
Yeah, that was the really frightening part for me as a child, because I watched a lot of monster movies, but yeah, if I saw that coming, I'd say, "Oh, that's a monster," and I'll run the other way. But if you see your uncle or your aunt or your mom or your dad coming, it's like, where's the clue that you pick up on until it's too late? And that's the frightening part.
Yeah, quite true.
Hiding in plain sight.
Well, some monsters can do that. I mean, you think about werewolves, who are human for most of the time. And you could think about vampires, depending on the story. I mean, in Dracula, one of the great things is that Dracula is just a Eastern European aristocrat, so he can fit in anywhere, and he fits in pretty well in Britain, by daylight. And this is why Karl Marx was kind of fond of both vampire and werewolf metaphors. That was for him a way of thinking about capitalism. But there's blood. Right? But yeah, these are the ones that pass as humans, and that's always unsettling. I'm a Scoop. I'm a little younger than you. I was born in '67, but I did see this when I was a little kid, and it did absolutely terrify me. And it was for that family reason, um, families and neighbors. That suddenly it's not just, you go through the woods to a foreign country and you find Castle Dracula, but here the monsters are, well, like John's communists. They're literally, in your closet, they're in your house, and it's too late. You can't do anything about it. You can't leave. Seeing that as a kid is especially horrifying.
I don't know. I may be the one person here. It didn't scare me so much as I was just kind of fascinated, the whole idea of it, And I read the original, I read the novel. I think I probably saw the film first and then read the novel by Jack Finney. The end of the novel was actually not as terrifying. At the end of the novel, the pods just kind of go back to space. They realize that they're having it's too much trouble for them to try to convert humans. So they decide to leave and drift back into space. That incidentally was originally serialized in Saturday Evening Post.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a real sci-fi hotbed Saturday evening.
Right. I know. It's
the whole idea of it being so believable to a young kid. The other movie that scared the shit out of me was The Manchurian Candidate, the original one. And I was very much into politics by then. And seeing something that you could, that sounds familiar, and it was scary. I walked out of that movie and I went out and thought about that for a long time. But monster movies, never really scared me. My daughter and I, we went to tons of them. Every Halloween, monster, Godzilla. I mean, I've got a whole Godzilla film festival here in my media closet. Yeah, I've got all the movies. And so that stuff never scared me, but it's when it's really super believable and you can see it happening to you. That's when it gets scary.
Yeah, when it's subtle.
Yeah. Subtlety is a scary monster.
And it was certainly subtle in Invasion of the Body Snatchers for much of it, especially that second version. And I actually agree with you, Brian. I think that 93 version was quite good too, but it was kind of a different, well, it was a similar story, but it didn't really follow the same, I guess, trajectory as the other two that were, as I said earlier, closer to the Jack Finney novel. And I think Philip Kaufman, one thing was that he wanted to make it more like the original intention for the first version, which was like to have an ending that was not pat, it's like you don't write the monsters off at the end. You actually show them winning. And it feels really hopeless. I just watched that again today. And it is kind of scary. It's really, you get this sense that there's no way there's no way out. The thing is spreading so fast. There's so many pods being distributed. And in the first one, it was just kind of like Santa Mira, this small town. Now, originally they were going to shoot it in Mill Valley, by the way. And in the San Francisco area. And then when Philip Kaufman was making it, of course, he lives in San Francisco and really likes it. He wanted to shoot it there. And also when they were kind of originally working on the remake, they gave some thought to doing the small town thing again. And that just didn't seem like it was the right fit. They really felt that, especially, they're 20 years later, that it made a lot more sense to put it in a big city. But it wasn't just that they put it in a larger city, a bigger context, but that they showed the thing spreading so fast. It was like there was no way that humans were going to outrun those things.
Well, in 1950s culture, the original, the way it was spreading, for that point in time, that was fast. I mean, we didn't have a lot of high speed anything. So the way it was spreading was so believable, and you could see that happening pretty fast. All those pesky farmers with their trucks full of pods. That was fast for the 50s.
It's interesting. You think about how I brought my own little pod person.
Oh, right.
Oh, nice pod.
Thank you. This is Ash. She's mostly floof, and also whenever there's a video, she shows up to make her appearance.
Of course.
But it's fascinating to think about that, John. I think you're really onto something. I mean, science fiction. This is also science fiction, not just horror. And horror and science fiction have always blended. You think the great original, not the first, but the great originary SF novel is Frankenstein, which is science fiction and horror both. But it's always about the present, right, as well as about whatever time it wants to be. And so if we think about the 50s, we're coming off the time when a lot of Americans lived in small towns or in rural areas. That was the vision that was still floating, that people still wanted. I mean, just a few years after this, Barry Goldwater is going to try and bring that vision back. Right? But by the 70s, we're clearly heading into the urban and suburban age. So it makes sense to have that, and the speed you described, Scoop. Having the virus pumped into the system so quickly is a sign of that greater efficiency and distribution of cities, especially a world city like San Francisco. That's to go back to the 90s movie just for a second. I mean, I was puzzled by it at the time because its main satirical poke was at the military, and that was unusual for the 90s. You didn't get a lot of that. And so it was clearly saying, well, if you want conformity, go right to the military and you've got it. Right? I admit I haven't seen the modern remake. I've heard terrible things about it, so it hasn't been worth my time. But I wonder again, just how that reflects a changing time. Do any of you watch the genre of movies usually called folk horror now?
Folk horror. I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah.
Is that like Saw?
No, the opposite. Folk horror is usually horror that takes place in the countryside, and the great original,
like Midsummer.
Yes, Midsummer is a perfect.
Okay.
Hereditary is another one to a degree.
Oh yeah, I've seen both of those.
Kind of the precursor for all of this is the awesome, Wicker Man. But the idea is that folk horror is taking off now because so many people have no experience of rural life. That the rural world is now shocking and surprising, and it's not something people look forward as a wistful recent memory, but it's just alien. So I mean, I wonder how the next Pod remake would be. Take place in maybe Hong Kong or London, and then the pods would drift down, not from space, but from the woods 100 miles away, perhaps.
It's an interesting point. I mean, so many people now are living in and have grown up in urban environments. Scoop and I are both from the same relatively small town. And Maggie, you're from Guantanamo Bay, right?
Yes.
Kind of a small town.
No, but did you grow up in an urban setting?
I grew up in both urban and rural, so I've had a little bit of both. But I think it's interesting too, because I was reading something about Airbnb today, how they're repositioning themselves, because since COVID, people like these little spores like me are going off to rural areas, and it's like they don't have to be tied to the urban environment anymore. So it'll be interesting how this all shakes out as everybody's shifting, and and how, I mean, I've lived in the sticks, so I'm used to it, but a lot of people I don't know if they know what they're getting into.
Yeah, for the urban dwellers, I can see how the rural areas would seem like a strange, evil environment. If you've never been there, it's the unknown is always frightening to some people. Yes. And I was frightened by the urban area when growing up in the same town as John, and suddenly going off to college, outside of Dallas. It was
Wow.
disorienting, go from podunk to urban Dallas. That was scary in itself. And I can see how someone who has lived in that environment all the time and they suddenly are exposed to the great outdoors and the great desolate areas, that would be scary to some people.
Watch for more of that. I've got to ask. I'm new to Plutopia, so I've got to ask. Maggie, are you? What's your favorite of all the Body Snatchers movies?
I like the original one, but I have this thing about 50s early sci-fi and early science fiction in general. It just from a sort of a nostalgia point, I don't know. It feels like a marker for me of I don't know. It's all about the world not making sense, but it's a marker of when the world did make sense to me. I don't know if that answers the question, but
Oh, it does. It does. So this, I mean, what kind of if you love 50s SF, what are the other movies around this time does this resonate with for you? The Thing, for example.
Well, yeah, I was thinking about that earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. The Thing was, I mean, the interesting thing about Invasion of the Body Snatch, one interesting thing about it is that they originally had funny stuff in there. There was part of it that was funny. People were supposed to laugh, and they screened it and people laughed, and maybe not always at the right time, but people found parts of it funny. And the studio made them remove all that stuff. They said, hey, horror films are not supposed to be funny. You've got to make it a straight horror film. But The Thing had funny stuff in it. It was like the people were kind of light and funny with each other. It kind of showed people under pressure being graceful, graceful in the sense that they were joking with each other and not just like cringing in horror. And I would really wish I could see that original Body Snatchers to see, whether it had that kind of rhythm to it as well.
It's too bad they didn't do director's cuts back then. That would be an interesting director's cut. But a lot of those old horror movies had a lot of humor. Maybe a lot of it unintentional. I'm a big fan of Mystery Science Theater 3000, one of my favorite television series, and I have it all recorded somewhere here in the server of doom. And they took a different, look at all of these old films that were scary when we were kids, but then you see that unintentional humor, and it's like, and so it's not quite as scary now after you've seen the Mystery Science Theater 3000 take on it.
Well, I have one movie that, like, when I was little, scared the crap out of me, and that was Invasion of the Saucer Men. And then I watched it a few years ago, and I was laughing my ass off. I was like, it's just so cornball. I mean, but another one that scared me was Kronos.
Yes.
Oh my God, oh my God, it terrified me. I had nightmares forever about that block thing.
I saw it like on a 3 o'clock in the afternoon at a friend's TV, and I thought I dreamed it for years.
Yeah.
I described to people, and they said, "What? I never heard of that."
Yeah. A lot of people didn't, and then I was really excited because my brother really likes old sci-fi, and remember one year, this was in the 90s, I think, I was able to obtain a DVD of it, and I gave it to him for Christmas, and he couldn't believe it. So, because we'd been talking about that one, and nobody else knew what it was. So, yeah.
Well, what's the one that Ray Bradbury wrote the screenplay for, about the alien that comes to Earth? I want to say it's called It. I'm not sure if that's right. But that's another one where you get an alien invasion, and there are a lot of those. Did you? What is the alien invasion where the aliens are in very badly done rubber suits?
That could be a lot of them.
Yeah.
It's all from a little. It's from a little kid's point of view, and they're Martians, and they have a
Yeah,
base.
that's Invaders from Mars. I was just thinking about that one.
Yeah.
They had their leader was a head
Yeah.
inside a glass globe
Yeah.
and with a really bad attitude and green skin.
So there's a theory about that, which says that the bad costumes actually served as a kind of relief for viewers, because it is actually scary in that it's from little kids' point of view, and the parents don't believe them that there are Martian invasions, going on and all this. So if you're a kid watching it, that little bit of fakery gives you a little distance. Like, so you think about the humor that you described that was in the original cut. It's a way if the pressure gets too intense, it lets off some of the pressure as a steam valve. And some of the early 30s horror movies did that. One of my favorite films of all time, The Black Cat, the one with Karloff and Lugosi. Absolutely insane film, and a little bits of comedy, which because the movie is so strange, it's hard to press to realize that comedy at first, but it's kind of welcome, in between. Necrophilia, mysterious cults, massive amounts of death. A little gag here or two is kind of nice. But the original, I found the 70s Invasion of the Body Snatchers to have that kind of comedy, but in the sense of satire, right? Like if you present the pod alternative to 1970s San Francisco, these guys will just suck it up because it just sounds great. It's like the early New Age movement is there, and therapy is there, and so it's a way of just getting in touch with your inner self, which turns out to be a pod. And so that's a sly wink in the middle.
Yeah, that Leonard Nimoy character especially, he was really great.
Amazing. He's amazing. I recently resaw a classic David Cronenberg film called The Brood, which is a very, very unsettling movie. And watching it now, it's chilling. It's easily one of his best. But have you all seen this?
No, I'm looking.
I believe I saw The Brood years ago. I don't remember much about it.
I don't want to spoil it because it does have a plot that does turn on some revelations. But the key thing is it begins with a New Age psychotherapy session. Is clearly horrible. It's clearly abusive and cult-like, but everybody greets it with rapturous adulation. This is fantastic. This is great. People love it. And
best, in other words.
Yeah.
Well, that reminds me of The Howling. The Howling is similar in that you have a sort of cult of werewolves who've fallen in with a sort of New Age psychotherapist who is trying to help them become more civil and
Native
less
American
hungry.
or something, or I'm not talking about the dang, oh my gosh, because I read about it. A book about Native Americans in film and how they're represented. Wasn't there something to that? And I'm not talking about
I think that a couple of the characters were Native Americans. Yeah. And wolves, by the way.
Yeah.
Werewolves.
Yeah, and that was carried forward in the Twilight stuff, later on. But anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt your flow. I remember that sparked a memory.
Well, The Howling was pretty interesting. It was written by John Sayles, by the way, and directed by Joe Dante. And one other thing I remember about it was that a sort of recurrent theme in the film was you kept seeing these little happy faces that were like stuck on things throughout the film.
That frightens me.
I mean, there was definitely some funny stuff in that film. But the funniest part was like Patrick McNee, who was like in the Avengers. You probably remember him from that. He played this psychotherapist. And these are spoilers, obviously, but it's an older film. What the hell? But he's been working with these werewolves, and he's been trying to get them to sort of fit in and maybe not kill people so much, And there's a kind of rebellion among those folks. They decide that they're not going there. but it's kind of different from Invasion of the Body Snatchers. The one that we mentioned that I think is closer to Invasion of the Body Snatchers is Invaders from Mars, because you also had people being sort of like occupied and manipulated by the aliens. The aliens would insert something in the back of their necks and control them with that. And the kid realizes at some point that his parents are really just automatons, basically controlled by the aliens. And that was pretty terrifying. You know, you went home and looked at your parents really closely after that.
Look at the back of their neck, check them for wires.
That's right. That's right.
But one thing, I know that one of these days in the near future, we're going to have a UFO, UAP, Plutopia. But I thought a lot about, you know, because my childhood is caught up in growing up in Northern Virginia, and my father in naval intelligence, and my uncle was in Air Force intelligence. He was part of Project Blue Book.
Oh, wow.
And I think about like what was going through my brain at that time, being there. You know, we saw things all the time in New England, and then later in Colorado when we lived near NORAD. And, you know, you had all this, you know, there was that whole 60s, 50s, 60s thing of all the UFO stuff. And that's when all these movies came out, you know, and what was, you know, so my brain over the years has tried to, like, what was that all about? What's going on here? You know, why did that overlap, you know? And then I think about, I remember that for years, I couldn't talk. There was nobody to talk to about this stuff. You just knew you didn't, like if you saw weird stuff, you know, if you knew, you know, you couldn't talk to anybody about it until a wonderful show in the 90s emerged called The X-Files. And all of a sudden, you know, all these, I remember being in the Bay Area and everybody started coming out of the woodwork, sharing these weird stories of being kids, you know, and seeing stuff. And you know, so anyway, just curious about what's up with that.
Well, it's kind of interesting that the extraterrestrial hypothesis regarding UFOs depends a lot on, you know, contemporary science fiction. The fact that we have been conditioned to believe that there are probably aliens and that they may have visited the earth or that we may have contact with them at some point. That's sort of a recurrent theme in some science fiction. So it's kind of easy, you know, when you see something strange in the sky that seems to be maneuvering, you know, it seems to have some intelligent operator, to assume that it has come from outer space. There are some who question whether we should make that conclusion, you know, or whether we should consider other possible explanations. But it's really hard to think of another explanation. I mean, do they come from another dimension? Do they come from the future?
Yeah.
Or do they come from outer space? It's kind of very easy to go there, you know?
Yeah. I'm definitely fond of the idea that these are aliens, but these are bad aliens. I don't mean invaders. These are basically teenage hooligans, you know, who are on the run, and which is why they're doing, you know,
they're doing donuts out on the
people.
street in front of your house.
Well, that's right. That's right. They're going around. It's like, you know, it's like toilet papering someone's house. Instead, they're doing core samples of cows. You know,
They're doing anal probing and
absolutely. I mean, think about it, right? But
Yeah.
I did want to ask Becky another question about this, because I'm fascinated that you grew up with this, like, plugged into the American. What's the word for it here? Military intelligence, surveillance, you know, cutting edge world, you know, NORAD and
Yeah.
well, so, but you see there's a vibe there that you detect, right?
Yeah.
What about now? We're having a sudden flash of interest in UFOs for various reasons, and we may have a government report come out in a few weeks, which might fizzle, it might be interesting, but are you seeing a similar vibe as, you know?
Yeah. I mean, it's really fascinating to me because, you know, like the 60 Minutes piece that a lot of people have seen, you know, it's Navy pilots, Navy. I, you know, it's like over the years, just always heard about, every once in a while, like my brother would be out surveying. He was a surveyor for the Bureau of Land Management. And, you'd wind up in a bar out in the middle of the desert, and there's some guy, like Wiesen guy, who was ex-military, and he tells you a little bit of things, but he can't tell you everything. Over and over the years, there was that kind of thing. And I remember my dad saying once, and I told him I wanted to study history, and he just said, "There's history you'll never know about." And I'm like, what does that mean? Like, what is that all about? And I just wonder. I mean, again, if it was, why is it all of a sudden, instead of the easily dismissible, the gal out in the trailer park who saw something that could, that everybody, the interviewer on the news, and every news broadcast, they always play like X-Files music before, they're denigrating this person. But it's a little different when you have military people saying, here's what we experienced, here's what we saw, this is what happened. And I find that, I don't know. I mean, I just, like, when I said I lived in Colorado near NORAD, we were like in the epicenter of the whole cattle mutilation area.
Wow. Yeah,
And-
now you're talking about my news beat, because our news service that I was with it for almost 12 years in San Francisco Zodiac News, we were carrying all that stuff. We were a radio news service that serviced the rock radio stations around the country. And I got immersed into that, against my will. I was a political reporter. I came out there, I was, covering political things. And of course, the boss says, check this stuff out. And we started getting stories about cattle mutilation and sheep being nerve gassed near Dugway Proving Grounds, which was a real thing. And I started talking, try to track these people down and talk to them. And it was evenly split between, the ones you would call up and say, well, I want more information. And you talk to them, you go, oh, right, you're nuts. Sorry. but then you get the ones that are ex-military, very, very logical people, and they're telling this story. And I'm going, this guy was there. And it was about a 50-50 split there. So, it's hard to get a real beat on what the real story is, because there's so many stories out there.
Right. Yeah. And all I can tell you is that when I was about 16, 17, so we lived halfway between Denver and Colorado Springs, and very rural. There was cows down in the valley below, and at night you'd hear them like just making distress noises every once in a while, like at 3 a.m, because you have your windows open in the summer. Well, my best friend Wayne and I, we'd go exploring around. And one night we headed down into one day we headed down into the valley. And in a bijou, which is an arroyo, basically, we found this dead cow. We didn't know about, we hadn't heard of cattle mutilations yet. We just run across this dead cow, and its eyes were missing, and its back parts were missing, and there was no blood, and there were no footprints, and it was like blackened and perfect, and we just didn't know what to make of it. We were freaked out. Like, we saw it and we went barreling back home like that. And so we just thought it was weird, but we forgot about it. And then like 3 months later, there was a special, like on the NBC affiliate, I think it was, from Denver. And this report from, I think it was Linda Moulton Howe, and it was on this new phenomenon called cattle mutilations. And I was like, I watched it, and Wayne had been watching it. We called each other and was like, oh my God, that's what that was. That's what that was, and so anyway, who knows? I just know what I saw, and I didn't have any, that was the first time I'd ever heard of that term before.
You were on the cutting edge.
Speaking of cattle mutilations, Kevin is here.
Yeah, our favorite cattle mutilator. Welcome.
You're muted, Kevin. You're muted.
What did they cattle mutilate get your tongue?
No, I owe all of you a huge apology because when I originally agreed to do this week, I forgot that I was going to be leaving to go camping on Memorial Day. But fortunately, I'm not very far away, so I was able to dial in remotely.
There you go.
So sorry, John.
Beer in hand, right?
Oh, well,
No,
are there
actually sparkling water in hand.
any pods out there where you're camping? Have you checked?
I have not fully explored yet, but I suppose it's a possibility. It's very idyllic, you know. There's probably something seedy just under the surface.
Oh, the idyllic spots are the ones you have to watch for. That's always where the pod or the monster is just right behind that pine tree.
This is where folk horror begins. Right?
Yeah.
Just wait until dark.
Well, I'm sure I've already missed very scintillating discussion, so I welcome being guided to where interesting things that have not been discussed are so far.
Well, John's been asking us which of the Odd People movies are our favorites, and so far the 1950s one is in the lead, followed closely by the 70s one. What's
Yeah.
your take?
I mean, I think I would have to say that of most films in that vein, you know, especially if we're talking explicitly about body snatchers, I mean, I'm a very bad fan that I've only seen the 50s and 70s, so I can't even talk about the others. But yeah, I think that would probably be about right. I think the 50s one does some things better. I think the 70s one does some things better. I think they're both great, and I think they're both suited for their era. I guess if we're going to widen the field a bit to just scary doppelganger films, I would be remiss to not mention the two Thing films from the 50s and 80s.
Yes, we did mention The Thing. One of the things we were talking about is that the 1951 version of The Thing from Another World was kind of funny. It had snappy patter, you know.
Yes,
and
yes,
that they had
does.
intended to
Howard
do
Hawks
that with Body
directed it, didn't he?
Snatchers, but didn't.
Howard Hawks directed the 50s one, right?
That's debatable. It was actually credited to Christian Nyby, who had worked with Hawks as, I think, his cinematographer. But the word is sort of like what you hear about Poltergeist. Tobe Hooper directed it, but Steven Spielberg was hanging out around there all the time and calling some of the shots. And it was sort of like that with Hawks and Nyby, I think.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's coming back now. It's been years since I've seen the 50s one because, as you said, the 50s one is mostly like almost a screwball comedy that just happens to have an eerie horror monster in it. It's not the just absolute terror the 80s one is. So I tend to watch the 80s one more.
So there's a grimly comic part in the short story the thing was based on, which I always liked. It was the base is huge. There's actually hundreds of people, so it's not just a handful. It's a huge military outfit, and they're doing the blood test to see who's an alien and who's a human, right? And so, but because there are hundreds, it takes a long time, and all the men, it's all men, know what's going on. So how do you keep them quiet? Well, they put them in the big auditorium and you show them cartoons. So I just love the idea of all these confused and terrified men under the ice, right, watching Mickey Mouse. While on the next screen you hear sizzle, sizzle, sizzle. And
wow. I was not familiar with that detail from the original short story. That's hilarious.
Well, real life happened like that to me when I got my smallpox vaccination at the age of 5. It was in Sweetwater, Texas, and they crowded all the kids into the local movie theater and were showing cartoons. And every now and then a nurse would come up and grab a kid and say, "Come on." One grabbed me and said, "Come on, kid." Next thing I know, they're sticking me in the
Oh,
arm.
wow.
And they said,
Wow.
take me back to my seat, and I continue watching cartoons. And I don't know if that was part of a big government plot. How they did. What else did they do to those kids?
I'm never
Well, I
going back to
think-
that theater again.
I
Well, yeah,
didn't.
and I don't know if this has already been touched on, but I think your story scoop is a decent this segue to say yes that the Thing films and the Body Snatcher films, if we're going to think about horror, as a genre and what are the primal things it works on, one of the very broad categories horror works in is fear of infection with something. And that can range from the personal, your own body being infected with something, all the way up to your entire society being infected with the other. And so fundamentally, that's one of the primal things you can scare people with. And the Thing and Body Snatcher films are very effective explorations of the contamination horror genre.
Yeah, it's interesting that the protagonist of the 1978 version worked for the health department.
All right.
Right.
Yeah. And he at some point says that we should be treating this as, well, really as a pandemic. He doesn't use that word, but that's kind of what he's saying. We should be trying to contain this spreading infection.
Right.
It's an outbreak.
Well, and what actually makes, something like that so imminently remakeable is when the Body Snatcher films are actually a little more concerned with the societal level of infection than the personal. The Things can be as well, but because of that, Body Snatcher, you can easily remake it for almost any era because it's whatever that society is afraid of being infected with. Like the 50s one, it can either be communism if you're on the right or McCarthyism if you're on the left. And the 70s one is just beautiful Watergate malaise, basically, in the same vein as Chinatown of our whole body politic has been infected. Basically, our country is infected with and frankly, the people who are infected don't mind. They're quite okay with things, actually.
There's that great scene at the end of 3 Days of the Condor when you've got the CIA whacking people at home, not too far, Maggie, from where you grew up.
Yeah.
And at the very end, the main character says, "Oh, it's okay. I'm going to reveal all to the press." And he says, "We're going to give it to the New York Times." And the evil intelligence guy looks at the New York Times, looks at our hero, shakes his head, and says, "You think we don't own them?" So you run out to the street. They're everywhere. They're everywhere. You go
That's right.
3 Days of the Condor is a great 70s paranoia film I wish more people had seen. And yes, and I think, once again, I'm not alive at the time, but hey, I've done my research. I think context somebody coming to the film now might not fully appreciate is 3 Days of the Condor literally came out the same year as the Church Committee hearings, where it was finally revealed to the public the massive scandal of what the FBI and CIA had been up to for the last 20 years. And so it was very much in the public mind that, oh, yes, they have agents in all major newspapers.
Right now in contemporary USA, it might be harder to scare somebody with something like this because we're kind of getting used to it.
Like,
We have
tell
information
me that-
viruses spreading. We have cults popping up. We had a pandemic,
Yeah,
What's
if
the
you
body
try to
snatchers and you
tell
say,
me
oh
that,
man, that's dull.
if you try to tell me that like the CIA has agents working at the New York Times, I'm like, yes, and
Well,
If you want to scare people, just talk about cyber terror now. It's the body snatchers, only they're snatching your dirty photos that you had on your hard drive, or you're snatching your bank account. That's to today's folks. That's pretty terrifying.
But
Yeah.
the thing that all of this works so well, but it brings me back to the opening of the 70s movie and some of the scenes in the 50s movie, which are that it's intimately personal and natural, the horror that comes. In the 70s movie, there are those shots of like blades of grass with little, just little touches of the alien on them. And there's that heartbreaking scene in the original movie. Remember when they run out to the cave, and our hero and our heroine, and they're like, "Oh, we're gonna stay awake," and our hero steps away just for like 5 minutes, comes back to the cave, and she's gone. Right? She's pod person, right? But one of the things is that's the more I thought about that, that's running to a cave for truth is something where there's a lot of mystical traditions about that. If you think of Muhammad or Jesus, and of course, going
Plato's allegory of the cave,
Exactly. Yeah. Here's the truth. Now there happen to be pod people. Again, just like in Plato's allegory, where people are happy to have the dumb show of the shadows.
Yeah.
Well, and I even think, if we want to talk about something that's not directly horror, but in a way is, and is also an examination of kind of the mundane horror of realizing that the people you thought you knew aren't who you thought they were. I think of the absurdist playwright Ionesco's Rhinoceros, which is, of course, about fascism, basically. But, he just discovers that everybody's turning into rhinoceroses. And he eventually... wait. Actually, our dog just went running. I may need to help get him back, actually.
And when you come back, make sure you show no emotions.
I will. All right. I may be able to join you for the end. We'll see here. I may be right back.
Okay, cool.
To be continued.
Actually, that part in the cave, I have to say, it affected my suspension of disbelief. It made the story less believable to me because I couldn't figure out by what mechanism she became the pod person, because there was no pod in the cave that you could see. I mean, where did that come from? It was like she just changed, but within her own body, and that didn't make sense.
Yeah, that was a plot hole there.
Yeah, and that always bothered me, from the very beginning.
I wonder if that was an edit, if they had a scene of night or, but yeah, that is, but it's, I guess that ties into the other thing too about this that I don't think we've mentioned, is that they come for you when you're sleeping. And sleep, is that great moment of vulnerability. There's the famous Fuseli painting of the woman stretched out with the demon squatting on her chest. All the UFO abduction stories, and of course sleep paralysis. This is when you are so vulnerable and also so close to dreams. That's really terrifying when you get to let down all your defenses and all of your guards, and then they get you.
Yeah, my wife gets frightened when we're asleep and I start breakdancing. That's turned out to be painful for both of us.
It feels painful to me right now.
You had to be there.
No, I'm glad I wasn't.
Oh, he's back. Well, is the dog still a dog, Kevin, or what is it changing into?
Right.
Well, if you've seen the 80s thing, you know about dogs.
Uh-oh.
I only know about Old Yeller. I stopped watching dogs on movies after that.
Well, for those who haven't seen the film, the dog, a dog is how the Antarctic base gets infected in this film.
Yeah, and the dog is coming from another base, and they made a later film that was like a prequel that showed what happened at that base.
Right.
Which is actually a pretty good film too. I mean, we could probably do another one of these talks and just talk about the thing, because there's
easily
some versions of that.
And I guess just, one thing I did, part of why I agreed to originally talk about this, that I'd like to maybe just quickly cram in here since we're about to run out of time, was that, I actually, in a senior thesis I wrote in college, I wrote a bit about the 50s invasion of the body snatchers because I identified it as one of the earliest examples of a very geeky subgenre of film known as tech noir. So think things like Blade Runner or Dark City, Existence, that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But But Invasion I identified as like a kind of early sort of predecessor of the genre, because basically the 50s Invasion is a film noir film that just happens to have this creepy, weird sci-fi element in it, basically. And I mean, you even have the seedy underbelly. It just happens they're pod people. But I identified tech noir as a genre in general that is fundamentally at its core, it's about what I call existential paranoia, where it's about doubting the things that seem certain in your world, whether they're certain, like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, are the people around you real? But then if you look at later tech noir films, it questions whether all sorts of things are real. Like it questions whether your memories are real or your reality is real. Think The Matrix or something. And so it's about, as it's said, it's about the fundamental building blocks of existence, questioning how much you can really know about them.
Things are not as they seem.
Yes.
I have a strange feeling, Kevin, that you and I were seeing a lot of the same things. I did some work on what I was calling the cyber gothic.
I suspect you and I should get to know each other better. It sounds like we have pretty similar interests.
We should. And that was the last time anybody saw Brian or Kevin, right? That was but every so often, late at night, we see images of them on 8-bit, that are on.
Well, I mean, that's why things like Blade Runner or Darkseid are why it's so effective. It's like, how do you know I'm me? Like, you're pretty sure I'm a person, but how do you actually know that? You're really just taking it on faith at the end of the day.
Yeah, we need to also explore time travel, because I always wonder, people always say, well, you can't time travel. But if someone time traveled and changed something, you wouldn't know it because you weren't there. And so there's a lot of ridiculous time travel movies.
Have you been following QAnon lately?
I time travel.
Try not.
I time travel every day, but it's always in the same direction.
Always forward.
Yeah.
Like a very slow time machine.
Yeah, except there's about 9 hours every day I just teleport into the future, usually at night. It's interesting.
There's a fantastic underread Ursula Le Guin novel called Lathe of Heaven.
I haven't read it, but I have seen the late 70s PBS little mini movie they made based on it. Yeah, it's a magnificent story.
Yeah, but the main character alters the world through his dreams,
mm-hmm.
and alters everybody's memories of the world. But
so he can't ever prove it because they don't remember it.
That would actually be Donald Trump, right?
I was trying to avoid that. But he's going insane at the beginning, right off the bat, because this is driving him nuts. There is a Trump angle, though, John, that you mentioned this. I was trying to resist it, but when people have been talking about either, especially QAnon, they'll compare often parents who become Q supporters to pod people.
Yes.
Not they become emotionless, but suddenly they've been replaced with somebody who's a raving conspiracist.
Anybody who's trapped in a cult seems like a pod person to those not in the cult, basically.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, there's a really good Reddit channel about just people sharing their despair at their parents, just like what happened to you, and there's that great documentary that woman did on. The name escapes me, but Fox ate my father's brain or something. And, this guy who had been lifelong Democrat when he was working out in the world. And then he got this job in the 80s or 90s, I guess, where he was having to commute for several hours every day. And he started listening to Rush Limbaugh. And then he started watching Fox News, and he became somebody completely other. And and she talked about his journey back to them, but yeah, there had to be, what's the term, reprogramming and all this stuff, and that's what it seems to me. I lost my aunt and uncle to that, and who are you? I don't even know who you are anymore. It's just very strange. So anyway,
I mean, it's not unlike the pod thing,
Yeah.
Well, even tying it back to the
colonized by something.
Yeah, even tying it back to the infection point, I'm of the opinion that, memetics are essentially mental viruses. And I think certain people have susceptibility to some of them and immunity to others of them. Like, you
Yeah.
know, some people, you expose them to the fascism mimetic virus, they're never going to catch it. They aren't predisposed to it. Other people who aren't fascist, you expose them to it, they're susceptible to it, and they will get infected by the idea.
Yeah.
Lots of that going around.
Yeah, most of those memes don't affect me, but I'm scared shitless of the Hello Kitty ones.
Well, it
I don't know what
seems
that
so
is.
harmless. That's how you know.
We have reached the end of the internet. No, we have reached the end of our time, actually.
It's funny.
Wow, that went fast.
Everybody check under your beds tonight and see, make sure there's no pods.
Well,
This has been
Maggie's
so
the
great.
MVP for remembering to text me, or I would not have remembered this was happening. So I apologize again, and thank you so much, Maggie.
Oh,
I
that's fine.
will be
And we hope
back
that
and not be tardy next time.
we hope that you'll come back. And Brian, we hope that you'll come back and join us again.
Oh, definitely. We want you to back. We have more explorations to get into. There's plenty of fodder for our explorations. Yeah, and as far as sci-fi goes.
Definitely, anytime you're talking about sci-fi, I'm happy to pop in and chat about it. I haven't read everything the way somebody like Corey has, but I know enough that I can usually be reasonably interesting.
I really appreciate the invitation, and I also appreciate your hosting. And if you want to talk about science fiction, horror, or general weird stuff, or the future, I'll be glad.
Weird is our
All of
middle
those
name.
things are on our beat.
All right.
Okay,
mean, if you-
thanks
if-
everybody.
All right, later.
Off we go.